Thank you all. Good evening. Thank you for coming. As Catherine said, so I'll just jump into this. The purpose today, is this working? You happy? Yes? Okay. The purpose of today's meeting is twofold. One is to update the stakeholders on the findings of the recently completed glyphosate presence study, and also to get your feedback. I will say that it is a draft study. It has not completed at this time. Well, the study is completed, but really? Okay, sorry. The study is draft, so we'll just keep that in mind as we go through the night. We would ask that formal submissions in writing be submitted to pollutioncontrol@gov.bm. You don't need, you can do that later. We will be taking notes, so we'll be recording what's going on tonight. But we would really appreciate if we get formal comments, formal requests for information, or information, or just any inquiries or further information that you would like to supply to us for consideration, that you either submit it to the pollutioncontrol@gov.bm or write in hard copy to the Ministry of Environment. The agenda for tonight is threefold. I'm going to summarize the timeline of our investigation. Then we'll present the findings and recommendations of the study. Jeff will be doing that, and questions and answers following. I'll skip through this. We've already had this. If you have any questions, that's who we are. And I'm going to skip straight into my presentation. My presentation is setting the scene. I'm going to recap where we were, how we got here, and what we've done so far. I thought this, just to set the scene, this is just a group of slides that show that the Bermuda that we know now is not what it used to be. In the 1850s, either the artist forgot his paintbrush and forgot how to paint trees, or there wasn't a lot. I do believe that there was not a lot of trees at the time. The native flora and fauna was actually quite sparse. This is followed by into the 1880s, and then during the 1880s there was an influx and quite a lot of importation of different species. So by the beginning of the 20th century, you actually had quite a flush of different species, and Bermuda was getting quite lush. However, by the 1940s, when we had the cedar blight, things changed. We went back to being quite stark. There was a massive impact to the landscape, and now we've ended up, and subsequently to that, there was quite an import of different types of plant species. This will become quite relevant in a minute. It takes species quite a long time to get established, 30, 40 years. And what we're seeing now is in some ways the impact or the result of a lot of those species being imported over the last 30, 40 years. So we're seeing a lot more invasive species, and we're having to manage those. Today we have a number, I'm sorry you can't see all this, it's probably quite small, but in 2015 we put out a policy on a number of species that were causing issues, that were being highlighted by members of the public and by our team. You'll know some of them. It started off by morning glory, but now we're into balloon vine. We've got a lot of grasses, etc. These need to be managed, or at least managed in some way. Some of the impacts, or I'm sort of illustrating some of the needs for weed control in Bermuda. You see these around. These are managed in a number of ways, and I'll describe those in a minute. But just to give you some idea of what the need is. You've got paving, driver and pedestrian safety, structural damage, and that can come in a couple of forms, walls, also cracking asphalt, and competition. Buried underneath the balloon vine there is a cedar tree. You wouldn't know it. And there's always calls from the members of the public to manage weed control, and we see these sporadically, mostly in the summer, when the weeds are at their most prolific. So there are calls to manage, and government has a service. Landscape companies have to provide a service, and it's usually by the most effective means possible. That's a lot to read. I wasn't going to read it, but if you're happy, I'll keep going. There's a number of ways of managing weeds. We're here to talk about managing through chemicals. At this moment, we're talking about glyphosate today. But there are other ways: cultural, mechanical, biological, and integrated pest management. So some of them, like mechanical, you'll know those by pulling weeds. Cultural, that is by through competition, out competing the undesirables. Biological, same sort of thing. You're using other plants to manage other plants, or other organisms to manage plants. And then there's integrated pest management. And integrated pest management, IPM, is a more eco-based strategy. It looks at prevention of pests or their damage through a combination of techniques. It's using a combination of techniques. That's its strength. It's not relying on one, it's relying on a number. And out of that, as a subset of that, is integrated vegetation management. And that is, it's a preventative measure, but it's the same sort of strategy. You're using the most tools at your disposal to manage, in this case, a plant problem. I'll give you a minute to read that if you need it. Now, talking about pest management in Bermuda, this is managed under the Pesticide Safety Act 2009, and two departments do it. It's a shared responsibility. Department of Environment and Natural Resources, sorry, it's quite dark, we manage importation. So in this case, we are evaluating pesticides for their impact to the environment and to humans, because we're part of that environment. And the Department of Health looks at sales, use, in this case, application, storage, and disposal. So again, we work in tandem with each other. But in this case, we're looking at importation, we're looking at evaluating glyphosate. Herbicide control. There are three main ways of using herbicides, or three types of herbicides, I should say. There's contact, systemic, and pre-emergent. In this case, systemic is the one, is a glyphosate, glyphosate is a systemic herbicide. And this is typical of what it would look like roadside spraying. So you can see its use. However, a contact spray would get the same effect. It would just come back most likely quicker, because you're only killing off the tops of the plants. You're not getting through the whole system of the plant. Now, glyphosate, which is what we're here to discuss, is a broad-spectrum systemic herbicide. It controls a lot of the issues. It's not very specific to a specific plant. And just a little bit of background about what it is. You'll all know it by the name Roundup. And of course, the Monsanto does come up, but Monsanto lost its trade name, or lost its patent in 2000. It's made by a number of companies. So just a little bit of background about glyphosate. One of the most widely used herbicides in the world. It's not only known as Roundup, but there are numerous packages, sorry, not packages, but treatments. Thank you. There's also one of the other things that happened over the last 2 decades, decade, is Monsanto Roundup Ready crops. If you're aware of those, this is where it's a GM, it's a genetically modified crop. It is able to withstand the application of glyphosate, and what happens with that is that any other weeds that it's sprayed, so glyphosate is sprayed, and any other competent weeds in competition will die off, but the crop that's intended to stay stays. In Bermuda, we don't, I've highlighted here, GM crops are not grown. Glyphosate is not known to be used by farmers on any GMO crop. We principally use it for weed control. It is not applied to crops as far as we're aware, and it's only used to prepare fields prior to seeding. So really we're talking about weed control in Bermuda rather than production of crops. And the importers, the people who use it most, I've listed them here, these are just the typical ones, are the government, the highway section on roadside spraying, hotels, golf courses, plant nurseries, basically anybody who's managing landscapes. This is a typical, this is a listing of perhaps the most well-used products that we're aware of. I've highlighted rodeo herbicide. This is the one that Dr. Smith will be discussing in the glyphosate present study. This is the one that is used by highways. I will note it's made by Dow and not Monsanto. Now there are alternatives, and when we were doing our study, and I'm just highlighting some other ways of managing weeds. These are we say alternative herbicides, and this was a study that was done by the University of Massachusetts in 2008. And just to give you an idea of some of the other things that are out there that we have over the last year either been told about or researched. So clove oil, I'm not even gonna try to pronounce that. Different types or different solutions or concentrations of sort of the same. And this is on the side there, you'll see conclusion. It says what they found. Just to give you some kind of idea. Can you see that? Or do I need to? We're talking about clove oil, citric acid, acetic acid, or vinegar. I'll give it a go. Pelargonic acid and clove oil, and the same combination of clove oil and pelargonic. And then there's a corn gluten meal. And they were used they had varying levels of success. In addition to that, there's also mechanical methods, mulches, burning, white clover coverage, which would be using it as a different type of, its competition. Hot water, steam and foam and hot water on farm plots, steam on the roadside. So these apparently have a very good or they have some success at immediate control. But they also mean that because you're only like a contact pesticide, they only hit the growth that's visible, but don't get into the actual system. So it normally means that you have to go back and do multiple treatments. So, and then conventional herbicides like glyphosate and ammonium, sorry, I'm not very good with these. I'm not the scientist in the room, just a lowly landscape architect. And this one has good seasonal control and is cost effective, but the reason why we're here is there are also issues that are associated with glyphosate. Now I'm going to lead you through the timeline so you understand where we've come from and how we've got to this point. In March 2015, the World Health Organization raised the level of glyphosate from a possible carcinogen to humans to probable carcinogen. As a result of that, a petition was received by the Minister of Health, Seniors and Environment to introduce the suspension, and out of the abundance of caution, a suspension was put on the importation of glyphosate products for 6 months pending a review. And we were instructed, the Department of Environment and Natural Resources was instructed to investigate the presence of residual glyphosates in the environment. In other words, what's here. And the project that we took on was the roadside spraying, and we were reviewing the Dow Chemical rodeo, which is made by Dow Chemicals. And that's the one, again, that's used by Ministry of Public Works for roadside weed control. Unfortunately, this is a challenge to do this type of work. Most labs are not set up to look for glyphosate, so it did take time to find an international lab that can do that. We don't do this. We have a small team in the Department of Environment, therefore we had to look outside for assistance. Now during that time, while we were trying to find a lab, I'm going to get this wrong. EFSA, which is the European Food Safety Authority, stated that glyphosate was not carcinogenic to humans, which prompted the minister to relax the importation on lower than 2% glyphosate. In February 2016, the department and the Department of Health gave us a stakeholder presentation. And from that, we got a list we gave an update, and then we committed to do the following. We would commit to complete a detection study by July 2016. We would then, completion of the review findings in conjunction with the EU studies, and we would submit the recommendation to the ministry. During the study, we would work with importers to identify effective environmentally friendly alternatives, promote the implementation of vegetation management strategies that I have tried to describe. We would permit the department would allow the importation of ready-to-use glyphosate formulations under 2%. But the ban on concentrated forms would remain until the final decision was made. May 2016, this kind of shows you the yo-yo that is happening now. This is an evolving subject. The World Health Organization said that glyphosate is unlikely to pose carcinogenic risk to humans from exposure through diet, and there was no reason to change existing acceptable daily intakes. The European Commission has, because of that recommendation, has extended approval of the substance with the following conditions. They've considered banning they have banned the co-formulation, which is the surfactant, is it not? The toluene? Yeah. From glyphosate-based products. They're also recommending the minimum use of the substance in public parks, public playgrounds, and gardens, and to minimize the pre-harvest use of glyphosate. In this mix, there are all sorts of other studies going on at the same time. Some of them are peer-reviewed, some of them are independent, and the department has been looking at a number of these studies, but these are either the World Health Organization or the European Commission. This is how we're getting our guidance. Now, in June 2016, we were able to take our samples, which were collected for analysis: air, water, sediment, soil, and foodstuffs. October 2016, the results were received we sent them overseas, I should say, between June and October, and we received the results back in October 2016. Between October to November, we've been developing the report. We did try to have a public consultation event in December 2016, but it was quite busy with Christmas, and there was not a lot of people on the island, and we thought better to defer till January. But nevertheless, we released the study on the government website so we could get the results out as fast as possible. There's been no changes to that study. It's been out there for public consumption, and you can view it still on gov.pm. And this is how we've arrived today at this public consultation. Again, it's a draft study. We're waiting on comment from yourselves, from members of the public who are not here. And as Jeff will say in his presentation coming up, we'll also reinforce that we want to have written consultation from yourselves. We want your input. All right. With that, I will pass it over to Dr. Smith.
First time I've presented to an audience, so it's been standing room only. Just to show how much we care about the environment, which is good. Right then, my name's Dr. Jeff Smith. I'm the environmental engineer at the pollution control section of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources in the Ministry of the Environment. It's a very small section, pollution control. It comprises myself, Patricia Hollis, who's the environmental officer, and Jim Thompson, who's the hydrogeologist who couldn't make it this evening. Normally, this particular section looks at all of the polluting, I normally call them controlled plants on the island, but with the audience today being focused on weed killers and the like, it's controlled equipment or facilities that pollute the environment, like sewage treatment plants, electrical generators like Belco. Sorry. Okay, yeah. Is it on? Are we good?
You have the yellow.
Okay, sorry. It's for this. It's for the TV, sorry. I will speak louder and more slowly. Okay. So there's about 500 polluting plants on the island that we license under the Clean Air Act. We also, under the Water Resources Act, we issue water rights for wells and boreholes, and there's about 4,100 of those that we issue licenses through the Environmental Authority at the moment. We do a number of other things as well. We issue refrigerant handling permits to refrigerant handlers that work on domestic and commercial systems. And usually our only involvement with pesticides is when we advise the plant control section at our same department about whether certain pesticides can be brought in to be used in certain environments that may, for example, be over one of the freshwater lenses. We would advise against that if it was a water-soluble pesticide, and so on. So normally we don't get involved with pesticide studies. This is the first one where we've actually, got very involved and done quite, some good work with an overseas laboratory. So that's myself. I presented a monitoring strategy to a stakeholder meeting back in February, and that still hasn't changed. Really? Sorry. Okay, the goal that I presented in February at the stakeholder meeting of this particular study was basically to determine what the risk was posed to the public, to the Ministry of Public Works pesticide applicator employee, and also to the environment, the risk posed from the herbicide glyphosate and also the degradation products. How are we going to do that? We were going to monitor the levels of glyphosate and the degradation products and compare them to the most stringent regulatory limits that we could find anywhere in the world, whether it be in the UK, the EU, the World Health Organization, or the United States. And then those would be compared for both drinking water limits, for inhalation limits, and also for ingestion limits. That was our goal. What would we monitor? We would monitor drinking water, first of all, to determine what the public risk was. Is this good at the moment? Yeah. We would look at the risk to the Ministry of Public Works applicator. You've probably seen him. I've got a picture of it coming up shortly. The air inside his cab, what was his risk? And we actually looked at the risk without taking into account the fact that he wears breathing personal protective equipment. We would also look at the air behind the applicator cab, immediately behind as he was spraying continually, and look at what the public risk was. We would also look at what glyphosate there was in the groundwater. We've already done a bit of work as part of our normal work looking at the environmental impact of various pollutants in the environment. So we had some data already, but we would re-look at the groundwater. We would re-look at pond water as well. We know a lot of our toads are suffering, and we've got a story on that as well for another day. We would also look at the roadside soils and pond sediments for environmental risk again. And then finally, to give us some sort of scale of what our exposure risk was, whether it be from inhaling it from the roadsides or in drinking it from groundwater or drinking water, we would compare it to the concentrations of glyphosate and the degradation products in the products that are imported to Bermuda from the States, from Canada, that are on our supermarket shelves. That's to give us some scale to what we're looking at. You've probably all seen this truck. The focus of the study was primarily on the risk posed by the Ministry of Public Works applicator vehicle. He normally sits inside the vehicle. It's a left-hand drive vehicle. He sits there with a nozzle, a bit like a gas buoy pump, and he sprays when he's going along the roadside where there's weeds, and he stops obviously when he approaches members of the public and other things. Yeah, I don't think anyone's been sprayed here, have they? Directly? Okay, well, we'll look at that. This is why we need to control people through a pesticide applicator program, which I'll come on to later. These are some of the filters. This is the one inside the cab I was using. This is the pump that would run while he was spraying. And there was also another filter at the back of the vehicle here. So we were taking samples when he was spraying for 90 minutes at a time, behind the vehicle and inside the vehicle. He was using Rodeo, which is the glyphosate product not developed by Monsanto, well, developed by Monsanto, but now sold and manufactured by other companies because the patents ran out. And this one's made by Dow Chemicals in Europe. Dow Chemicals recommend diluting the concentrate. Obviously, it's cheaper in Bermuda to bring in the concentrate because you don't want to be transporting water. So you dilute the concentrate. Rodeo recommend to dilute it down to between 0.75 and 2%. Public Works find they get good results just operating at between 0.53 and 0.56%. In the back of the truck, I'll mention here, is a 100-gallon container of, typically a half a gallon of glyphosate concentrate, and the rest is made up with water. He has 2 spray settings depending on the width of the swath, whether it's a narrow area of roadside area that needs to be sprayed with weeds or a wider area. And the typical, he's operating typically around about 4 miles an hour, and we estimate from the volume and the roads that he can do in that time that it's about 40 millilitres of this diluted glyphosate that is applied per metre square on the roadside. The tank is emptied after 60 minutes, so he has to go back out again in order to get our 90 minutes that we needed for the air samples. And he tends to spray, this is his program at the moment, between 5 in the morning and 7:30. He then avoids the rush hour, and then he'll spray again from 9 a.m. to 12 noon. He doesn't spray when it's windy, he doesn't spray when it's raining or when it's about to rain. And the air sampling equipment that we used is that based on the US Occupational Health and Safety Administration, and it's a specific method that we followed for that. So we had to try and find a laboratory that could, A, measure to the detection limit that we needed. We didn't want reports to come back that it was less than a few ppm with the detection limit of the method. We wanted to be measuring down at parts per billion. In fact, I'll show you we're measuring at parts per trillion. So we were confident that the data we were getting when it shows below detection limits is pretty low. We needed to make sure we could find a company that could measure the degradation products as well. They could measure it in the air filters, the water, the groundwater, the potable water, the soils, the sediments, and also in the foodstuffs. We found a laboratory. It was in British Columbia in Canada. It was Axis. We looked in the US, Canada, and the UK, and that was the best one that we could find. We almost had a laboratory that could do the surfactants, where there's some question mark in the Roundup product specifically on their interaction, even though they're not listed as active ingredients with the glyphosate, but it didn't happen in the end. The equipment, the analytical equipment failed just before the analysis, and there was no one else we could find in the world that could do those. So, what were the detection limits? It's a bit technical, this, I know, but 10 nanograms per litre of glyphosate in water is equivalent, if you measure grams per mil, which is the same volume per volume ratio, is equivalent to 10 parts per trillion. So if it was a 1 there, it'd be 10 parts per thousand. A 1 there, that would be, 1 part per million. The next one would be part per billion, and then 10 parts per trillion. The reason I'm adding 3 extra zeros is this is grams per litre. It'd be the same as measuring kilograms per litre. It would add another 3 zeros. Soils and sediments, the detection limit was around about 30 parts per billion, or 30 nanograms per gram. Detection limit in air was around about, that is 0.7 parts per trillion, I believe. And foodstuffs was around about 0.4 parts per trillion. So we're quite happy that the measurements we were getting were real and were covering all low concentrations. I've got 3 slides now that compare the legislative limits in other parts of the world or the World Health Organization. You'll see here in the UK, for drinking water, potable water, the limit is 100 nanograms per litre, which is 10 times higher than the detection limit of the method we were using. And that's measured at the person's tap normally. And it's based on the European Union Drinking Water Directive. And this applies to any pesticide. So it would be the same whether it was DDT, whether it was paraquat, whether it was glyphosate. So they apply that to any pesticide. It must not be higher than 100 nanograms per litre in potable water. The US, not as stringent as the EU and the UK, 700,000, which sounds terrible, but it all depends on your unit. That is the same as saying it's 0.7 milligrams per litre. Doesn't sound so bad then, does it? However, 700,000 nanograms per litre sounds terrible. So it gives you an idea of the detection limit of the method that we're working in. I've kept the units the same at those detection limits. Canada is a little bit more stringent, but not much. And Australia actually recently, in February 2016, relaxed their limit. It was more stringent than this. So there's a lot of things happening here at play. We also wanted to look at the inhalation limits. So this relates to what the Ministry of Public Works applicator is exposed to, and also to people behind the cab or on the roadsides. The American Conference of Government and Industrial Hygienists, this is the first time I've come across them as part of this study, doesn't set a threshold value for glyphosate in the air. The EU does not have any occupational limits either, which is partly driven by the Material Safety Data Sheet. If you look at one of those for glyphosate, it doesn't look as bad, so you then start to question that. The US Occupational Safety and Health Administration also don't set permissible exposure limits for glyphosate. However, they decided that they needed to have an arbitrary limit, so they've set one of 1 milligram per meter cubed. We will consider any other occupational limits that come in the fullness of time from any other country or any other, or the World Health Organization, for example. And then we can back relate our data that we collected already to those limits. Ingestion limits. Now this is a bit more complicated. There are such things called acceptable daily intake levels, ADIs, that the governments set. I'll go through this a point at a time. You might have some questions on this at the end. They're set based on a suitable safety margin below the lowest high concentration displaying no observable adverse effect levels of a particular test animal. So what does that mean? If you're doing tests of a particular pesticide on, say, rats, for example, you might find that as you raise the concentration, there's no effect to a point where you get an effect on, say, the kidneys. You may also find that as you raise the concentration, looking for a different effect, maybe some sort of endocrine disruption, that may happen a little bit lower. And then the effect is more noticeable as the concentration rises. You may be looking for rashes on the skin, for example, of these laboratory animals, in which case the concentration for that to start occurring may be a lot lower again. You basically take the lowest concentration where the observable effect was detected, and then you base, I'll come on to this, depending whether it's a test on lab animals, you work out their weight, and then you work out an acceptable daily intake, multiplying up the weight with a safety margin of, say, 100 in there, on top of that, to people. So you take, as I just said, you take the lowest range effect, lowest effect. The safety margin is 100 times for test animals in laboratories, or 10 times if the test data was on human data. So you take 10 times lower again. It's considered the safe intake level for a healthy adult of normal weight who consumes average daily amounts of a substance in question. So they include, in the US, the Environmental Protection Agency sets a chronic reference dose limit of 1.75 milligrams per kilogram of our body weight per day is what we're allowed to ingest. So they've worked all these things out for all sorts of pesticides, all sorts of chemicals. The European Food and Safety Authority, does the same. And with regards to glyphosate, their limit is more stringent at 0.5 milligrams of glyphosate, or degradation products included, per kilogram of our body weight per day. Normally in Bermuda we wouldn't get into these we model our legislation on, the EU or the UK, or the UK primarily. World Health Organization set an acceptable daily intake level of 0.3 milligrams per kilogram of a person's body weight per day. And then the most stringent one we could find as part of this study was the European Food and Safety Authority operator exposure level at 0.1 milligrams per kilogram body weight per day. So if these get more stringent based on studies that are occurring at the moment in the literature that then get taken up further by the various governments or by the World Health Organization, for example, that can act more quickly, then we can apply our data that we've got so far back to this. So I've now got some data. So that's all sort of setting the scene. We have various water samples collected here on the left. We have the concentration of glyphosate, and then we have the two columns on the right include the degradation products, glyphosinate and amino-methyl phosphonic acid, AMPA. Anything that has a less than sign, and I've made those numbers a bit smaller and not in bold, that's at the detection limit of the method. The reason the detection limits are different for all of these methods is that the laboratory we used are very fastidious, very stringent. They have internal standards that cover both the extraction, the derivatization during the process, and then the analysis. So using internal standards over that whole analytical procedure, you can actually get a detection limit for each particular sample you're analyzing. Groundwater from VC Street, which is in the central freshwater lens, we didn't detect any, below 10 parts per trillion. Groundwater, Orange Valley, one sample was detected with glyphosate in it, no degradation products, at just above the detection limit, so 10.2 parts per trillion, or nanograms per litre. Cloverdale Pond, which is an area we've been studying for other things more recently, also had some glyphosate detected in it at 10.8 nanograms per litre, or parts per trillion. We then took, at the Prospect government facility that is taking the groundwater from the central lens, the fresh water, and then treating it through reverse osmosis membranes to make potable water before it sends it out to the distribution lines. We measured the influent water, the groundwater, which is actually slightly more concentrated, and we found they didn't have any glyphosate in that where we at the Prospect location, obviously very close to the couple of samples where glyphosate was detected. And then in the potable water that came out, you wouldn't expect, having pushed it through a very small, fine reverse osmosis membrane, to see any either, which we didn't. And obviously these numbers here compared to the most stringent drinking water standard we can find for the EU, which is 100 nanograms per litre. So the potable water, the potable water, groundwater in Bermuda looks to be safe from these samples that we've analysed. In fact, I would say compared to a lot of other countries where I've looked at groundwater data that do a lot of spraying of glyphosate for GM crops and also for spraying as a desiccant on non-GM crops, these values are very, very low. I would also add that the water section of Ministry of Public Works also analyses routinely a whole range of pesticides and pollutants in their groundwater, which they have to do as part of the Drinking Water Inspectorate in the UK, or which we choose to do. They do as part of their legislation, and they have never detected glyphosate either. However, just to give you an idea of the detection limits of their methods compared to the one that we found, and we're going to certainly pass this data on to, or the analytical laboratory in Canada on to Public Works, their detection limit was 10,000 nanograms per litre, or 10 micrograms per litre, which is reasonable. This, for example, gives you an idea. I'm not going to dwell on it. These are some of the samples, the pesticides and herbicides that the Public Works routinely monitor at Tynes Bay, Saltwater RO, Tudor Hill, Prospect, St George's, and also in the distribution lines. They're all at detection limits, except for, obviously, we expect to have some nitrate, nitrite. We have cesspits, and there's a bit of a closed loop there. We have some turbidity. We have some sulfate, which you expect because mixing with seawater. pH seems reasonable. Total dissolved solids is fine. You want to have some solids. So that just gives you some reassurances of what Public Works is already doing with the drinking water on the island. With regards to environmental limits, the only standards I could find were Canadian Water Quality Guidelines and California State Water Resources Board guidelines, and we've already seen that we're already meeting the drinking water standards in the ponds. We easily met those as well. So glyphosate was not detected in the potable water in Bermuda. It's generated from government, from groundwater resources. It was detected in a pond water and one groundwater at very close to the detection limit at 10 parts per trillion, which would meet any drinking water standard that we've found. Glyphosate concentration in ponds, many orders of magnitude below the stated toxic level for organisms. And we look at a whole range of other pollutants in the ponds. We know that the toads and the killifish are having a hard time, but they're due to other chemicals that we're monitoring. And these results are consistent in the water in that glyphosate doesn't want to stay in the water fraction for long. It quickly partitions into the solids, into the particulates and sediments. So there was no surprises really in this data so far, but it was good to go through this exercise. The results for the sediments. Now we've got, again, sediments and soils on the left. Glyphosate is the middle column. Glufosinate, which is one of the degradation products at below detection limits, and AMPA was present as well. Now what we have here is sediment at Cloverdale Pond and then a duplicate sample, both are at detection limits this is 30 parts per billion. The soil at McGall's on the roadside, which had been sprayed no more than 4 months before then, was at 886 nanograms per gram. The soil on Harrington Sound Road, near the quarry, which had been sprayed less than 4 months prior, was at 949 nanograms per gram. North Shore Road, that had been sprayed within a week, was at 6,120, so it's there on the roadside. And then Blackwatch Pass was at 51,200. I put an asterisk next to that. And it looks a bit of an outlier to me, and the reason I put an asterisk is when we went to take these samples, it looked very much like this. There were some areas of soil on the side of the road that had some weeds on it, But you can see here it's very much the limestone walls coming down to the sidewalk, and it's just sort of roadside dust and detritus that basically forms the substrate for the weeds. So in this instance, I would say that, you know, the Public Works applicator probably shouldn't have applied his spray there. He should have, you know, got a road crew to go and clear the weeds, which are probably quite easy to clear up against the limestone and the road. But that's probably the reason, less than a week ago, that it was oversprayed with glyphosate from his truck. We're not aware of any sediment quality guidelines for glyphosate. We are aware of, because we use this as a requirement for one of the control plants, which is the Marsh Folly Compost Facility, has to show that it meets the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment pesticide limits and herbicide limits. There are 2 limits there, which is similar to our risk-based corrective action guidelines that we have in Bermuda, and it's always more stringent for agricultural and residential zoned land than it is for commercial industrial zoned land. And you can see from this data that basically the roadsides, ignoring the outlier at Blackwatch Pass, which is over the commercial industrial zoned land limit, and this is related to the risk of people ingesting the soil. And the reason it is more stringent in residential and agricultural areas is if it's in your garden and you put your child in the garden, they're more likely to play in the dirt and the chance of them ingesting dirt, and that's why it's more stringent. Similarly, agricultural, you're likely to eat some of the soil in the foodstuffs that you're preparing as well. So that's why it's more stringent, and we do the same here with our risk-based corrective action guidelines. But it basically shows that the soils on the side of the road don't meet agricultural residential zoned land, and that's what it comes out in the conclusions. And also the Canadian limits apply to any pesticide. So like we saw for the EU and the UK drinking water standards, it applies to any pesticide, whether it's DDT or malathion or whatever. It's noted that they're more stringent. I've already explained that, due to the increased risk of ingesting the soil in agricultural and residential settings. And we wouldn't recommend using the roadside for growing your crops, which has some implications in that, you know, should we be spraying on the roadside where there's crops growing? You would say no. However, we know that because the herbicide is partitions into the particulates very quickly, and that government has, I'll come on to it in a minute, over 1,000 catch basins on the island, providing you can show that anything you spray on the roadside is then going to drain into the ground via a catch basin and not directly into the agricultural land, then you could argue that you could potentially use that there, but it may be better to avoid any roadsides where there's agricultural land alongside it from spraying any pesticides. Okay, it doesn't appear to be a present in pond sediment. So that's all the results of the soils and sediments. So we've covered the water, groundwater, potable water, soil sediments. Now we get into the air samples, a little bit more complicated now. What we have here are 5 pairs of samples, and each sample was either taken from a vehicle route that I've described here, and each pair of samples one sample was taken from inside of the cab, and at the same time a sample was taken from behind the cab, as I showed you in that drawing earlier. We have 5 of those. We measured glyphosate. I've got it shown here in nanograms per litre of air, and I've also got glyphosate shown in milligrams per metre cubed, which I'll explain why. It's the same concentration, just different units. The degradation products on the right weren't detected, which you would expect because it's a neat product. It hasn't had time to degrade in the sample container because it's literally used fresh once he dilutes it in water. Conclusions. The concentrations inside the applicator cab compared to outside of the applicator cab couldn't be differentiated statistically. So I would say, based on this, that the critical group is the Ministry of Public Works applicator for us to base a lot of our calculations on in terms of whether we should or should not be spraying with glyphosate. The most stringent airborne concentration, as I showed earlier, is from the Occupational Safety and Health Authority in the States, and they have set an arbitrary limit of 1 milligram per metre cubed of glyphosate. And that, you're comparing 1 milligram per litre with this column here. So the concentrations we were detecting in the cab and behind the vehicle were less than 5% of the occupational safety and health limit for the United States. Obviously, if more stringent standards come out from the World Health Organization or from the UK or from the EU, we can apply our same data to those and then determine whether changes need to be made. I will also add that these concentrations were taken straight from the filter. They did not allow for the fact that as I said earlier, that the applicator wears not just a particle mask, but a vapor mask as well over his mouth. So obviously he would be exposed to a lot less than this data here, but we're looking at worst case. There was only one inhalation limit, but based on a few assumptions, we can try and use the inhalation exposure of the applicator for public works to some ingestion limits. And I'll just go through what those assumptions are now. First of all, we can use the most stringent European Food and Safety Authority applicator limit of 0.1 milligrams per kilogram body weight of the applicator per day. The assumptions are that all of the air he inhales, he doesn't breathe out the glyphosate, that it all goes into his body, so that's a worst case scenario. We're also assuming that he's not wearing a particle mask or a vapor mask, which he is. We assume that his average weight is 60 kilograms. So if you apply 60 kilograms to 0.1 milligrams per kilogram of his body weight per day, he's actually a bit heavier than this. But I know, yeah, Aaron, I know the guy, yeah. But this is a standard 60 kilograms that is used in other tests, but bear with me. So that equates to 6 milligrams of glyphosate per day that he is allowed to ingest without exceeding the European Food and Safety Agency limit, the most stringent one we could find. If we assume from one study that the average breathing rate is 11 litres per minute, which would be while driving, I have doubled that to 22 litres per minute. So again, I'm taking a worst case scenario, trying to up his exposure to see if it's significant. We also know that looking at his hours earlier, he sprays for up to 5.5 hours per day. The time he's obviously filling up or having his lunch. But if we assume an 8-hour working day, again, we're assuming another worst case scenario. So that equates to the worst case, highest volume of air he's likely to inhale of 10.6 meters cubed per day. If you multiply that through the concentrations we measured and take in the highest concentration, that equates to 496,080 nanograms of glyphosate he ingests, or equivalent to 0.496 milligrams of glyphosate per day. That number, 0.496, needs to then be compared to the 6 milligrams, which is what the European Food and Safety Agency most stringent limit says that he can ingest per day and be safe. So we're less than 9% of that limit. So with the inhalation limit that we used from the US Occupational Safety and Health Administration, it's less than 5%, and here it's less than 9%. So it's ballpark. Now, this is the most interesting stuff that we came across. We collected foodstuffs from the supermarkets in Bermuda that have been imported items from the US or from Canada, and we looked at whole wheat flour, we looked at a triplicate of all-purpose flour, quick oats, popcorn. We then selected some non-GMO popcorn, some cornflakes, cornmeal that was labelled organic, and cornmeal. And we sent these samples off for analysis. We did have other types of samples. I wanted to do a coffee creamer. I wanted to do some canola oil. But they wanted another few $1,000s of method development for these, because the laboratory axis were very good at doing the water, the soils, and foodstuffs. But if you wanted to get into oils and things, it was a different methodology, and they needed to validate the method, so we didn't go that way. The concentrations of glyphosate in wheat flour were 603 nanograms per gram. The highest, quick oats, was 1,140 nanograms per gram, or 1.1 micrograms per gram of glyphosate, with some AMPA degradation product in it as well. Even the organic cornmeal had a trace amount, unless that's that's still over an order of magnitude above the detection limit, almost above the laboratory method. And the non-GMO popcorn was good to eat, but then again, the popcorn that wasn't stated as non-GMO was good to eat too in terms of glyphosate. But then again, I would argue that, we'll come on to this in a minute, all of these are safe to eat according to the European Food and Safety Agency acceptable operator exposure levels of 0.1 milligrams per kilogram body weight, which if you multiply up for a 60 kilogram person, equates to 6 milligrams per day per person. And if you multiply that into these figures here, the amount of foodstuff in kilograms, so just over double it for pounds, that they would need to eat to exceed that limit is shown here in the middle column. So you need to have over 10 kilograms of whole wheat flour, 20 to 30 kilograms of all-purpose flour, only 5.3 kilograms of quick oats, but still a hearty breakfast. 556 kilograms of cornflakes, and safe there, and cornmeal 231. And then what I did then, I'm sort of playing with the data now, if you equate the amount of foodstuff that you would need to ingest to have the same exposure as the Ministry of Public Works applicator employee, bearing in mind we consider him to be the critical group, and bearing in mind it will actually be less than these values because we're assuming he wasn't wearing a respirator and he's doing it for longer and so on and so forth, then we've got some, more manageable figures here. But, his exposure equivalent to eating just under half a kilogram of quick oats a day. So it's all food for thought. Excuse the pun. So the message here is basically the foodstuffs are safe based on the limits at the moment set by the most stringent European Food and Safety Agency that we can find. And the exposure risk is not that far off, maybe even comparable, you could argue, to what the applicator who works for Ministry of Public Works, the one guy, is exposed to as well on his working days. Scary stuff sometimes. So, we analyse the foodstuffs, only provide us some scale to the exposure. We're not trying to out any particular foodstuffs, food manufacturers. Glyphosate was present in most of the foodstuffs sampled, but according to both the World Health Organization and the European Food and Safety Agency, is safe relative to their most stringent acceptable daily intake levels for ingestion. And the conclusions. The purpose of the study was to determine if there was a health risk to the public works employee and to the environment, specifically from the roadside weed control program. That was our goal. Comparison with the most stringent inhalation and ingestion standards stipulated over the world showed that the risk is negligible. Similarly, the glyphosate exposure risk to organisms in Bermuda is negligible. There are other things that we are looking at that they are definitely getting affected by. The public exposure risk to glyphosate from foodstuffs that are imported to Bermuda is also shown to be negligible and well within the acceptable daily intake limits. If, however, as a result of our study, or as a result of the World Health Organization or European Food and Safety Agency making their limits more stringent in the near future, or the far future, or not at all, we can apply the same data that we've collected now to that to determine what our risk is. So we're very much data-driven with our approach. I've got 3 slides of recommendations. This is the critical bit. So based on the data collected, we can't justify continuing the current suspension, a suspension implemented by the Ministry of the Environment, on the concentrated glyphosate for use with roadside weed control. However, we would recommend, before the suspension is lifted, the following recommendations become adhered to. So this is our precautionary approach, if you like. We will monitor the overseas legislation, and if the public becomes aware, or any other bodies of other legislation in other jurisdictions that is more stringent, please send that to us and we can certainly apply the data to that. But compared to the data we found so far, everything appears to be within the limits stipulated. We will continue to monitor this and other pesticides in the environment. To do more work at these detection limits for a whole range of other pesticides will require some more funding going forward, as you can imagine. We acknowledge that with any environmental chemical treatments that a precautionary approach should be taken. The use of chemical inhibitors should only be considered once we've gone through the integrated pest management process of looking at mechanical and other physical techniques of managing the pesticides. And then you have to discount them as well for acceptable reasons that would be deemed acceptable by government, and I'll come on to that in a minute. We would recommend that before anyone imports the concentrated pesticide formulations, not the ready-to-use, which are currently not banned or not suspended, that the personnel demonstrate sufficient training and certification. Now, this training and certification under the Pesticide Safety Act currently doesn't exist in Bermuda. Under the Pesticide and Safety Act, we have implemented the importation requirements, whether you can import them or not. But with regards to making sure that the personnel that are applying these pesticides on the island are deemed competent to, with training and certification to a stated standard has yet to be set up. This is something that's being managed by the Department of Health under the Pesticide Safety Act. The timing for that is yet to be determined. We're expecting it to be based, but we're not sure yet, on the US National Core Pesticide Applicator Program. Department of Health may have some more information on that. We would expect a competent person to follow a risk assessment process and the integrated pest management process in order to consider minimizing the reliance on the chemicals. We would also need that person to undergo annual health assessments managed by the Chief Medical Officer. I've got a slide here now which just quickly covers, we've already heard about integrated pest management, and the definitions here, you don't need that repeated. But while this suspension on the concentrate was in place, I thought, well, this is an ideal opportunity to see if there was something natural that we generate on the island here that we could use in the meantime, or instead replace glyphosate. Some of the alternative methods are based on using concentrated saline and detergent, and where best to get concentrated saline from, but from the brine from the saltwater reverse osmosis plants on the island, which is typically about 1.5 times the concentration of seawater. So we did do some trials with this very concentrated 1.5 times seawater concentration water with detergent. Unfortunately, we got dieback, which was great, but it only lasted a few days, which I think is what you see really after a hurricane passes through. So going back to the recommendations, subsequent to the pesticide applicator program being set up and the people being deemed competent under that by the Department of Health, we would expect a risk assessment, integrated pest management program. We would expect there to be no pesticide spraying along the roadsides that drain directly into agricultural land. We would expect the assessment to consider whether there's catch basins in those areas that would potentially capture the glyphosate or not, to be taken into consideration as well. We have all of the agricultural zoned areas on a geographical information system. We also have all of the catchment areas, so this is something that could quite easily be programmed into a GPS system once the applicator program is in place. And then we could use it then to mitigate the risk. Also, for other reasons, we would like to see more catch basins included on roadsides, just to capture the soot from the vehicles of that are going along those roads anyway, because we know that the polyaromatic hydrocarbons in those particular, in the soot is actually definitely known as a carcinogen. Drew mentioned earlier that the whole reason this petition started and the suspension came into being was when the World Health Organization raised the classification of glyphosate from a possible to a probable carcinogen, of which there are other probable carcinogens and activities in Bermuda that already exist. There are also a whole range of other carcinogens, known carcinogens, not possible or probable, that exist in Bermuda as well, and activities as well. Certain lifestyles, yes, you could say, but also occupations. But also you're exposed to cancers in that line of work as well. So those things need to be taken into account. And finally, we need to provide a method, if all of those other conditions were met, of actually informing by the government portal the public of where and when pesticide application would be applied on the roadside outside of those areas that have been deemed, agricultural or whatever. So those are our recommendations. I'd like to thank you for listening. As Drew mentioned as well, we will capture any questions today. We will also capture questions that may occur to you up until the 18th of January, and then we'll try and put these questions and answers, or we will put them on the portal, hopefully sometime in February.